Section 24 of the Crusades by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 14. The Ninth Crusade. Throughout the history of the Crusades, the wisdom of the general or the statesman is conspicuous by its absence, and we may fairly compare the long series of these wild enterprises with the erratic course and fitful splendor of a comet, which at the moment of its greatest brilliancy rushes off into an ocean of darkness. They carried with them, as we have seen, not one of the elements of permanent success, while they lasted long enough to impoverish myriads and carry misery and grief to the homes of millions. But the qualities which had won for the earlier Crusaders whatever renown they may have acquired were exhibited in full measure to the end. Their absolute fearlessness, their firm persistence in the faith which alone they could allow to be true, their heroic endurance of the suffering which in hours of triumph they seldom hesitated to inflict on others, are beyond question. But all these are virtues which, apart from the sagacity of the wise ruler, may be brilliant, but must be eminently useless. This wisdom the Latin Christians of Palestine were destined never to learn. Disunion ran perpetually into quarrels sometimes into open warfare. Between the Venetians and the men of Pisa and Genoa there was but at best but a hollow truce. The side which the Templars might take in a dispute was not that which would be taken by the Hospitallers or the Teutonic Knights, and the schism of the two former of these orders led in 1259 to a pitched battle from which scarcely a Templar escaped alive. From slaughtering each other, the champions of the cross passed to the slaughter-houses of the Saracen executioners. The savage warriors of the Mameluke Sultan Baibars seized Nazareth and Acre, torturing to death those who had not been happy enough to fall on the battlefield. 90 Hospitallers held the fortress of Azotus. The last of them died when at length their enemies stormed the walls. The castle of Safuri was surrendered by the Templars on the condition that the garrison, numbering 600 men in all, should be safely conveyed to the next Christian town. The Sultan flung the treaty to the winds, and gave them a few hours to make their choice between death and apostasy. The prior and 2 Franciscan monks besought their companions to stand fast in their faith, and when the Sultan demanded their answer, not a man shrunk from the penalty of refusal. All were slaughtered, the prior with the 2 monks being flayed alive. At length the tidings reached Europe that Bohemund VI had been driven from Antioch, and that his city had passed into the hands of the unbelievers. The saintly Louis still yearned for the rescue of the holy places, but the memory of his past disasters led him to fear that his sinfulness or his bad generalship might again bring disgrace on the Christian arms. His diffidence called forth the encouragement of Pope Clement IV, who with greater importunity urged Henry III of England to do his duty by taking the cross. 3 years had passed since the fatal defeat of Simon of Montfort, Earl of Leicester, at Evesham in 1265. But the country, though not in actual war, was by no means in a state of repose, and we might wonder why at such a time the prince who was afterwards to reign as Edward I should pledge himself to the new crusade. Were it not clear that the enterprise was one which might be used for the purpose of drawing away from England men who might be troublesome or dangerous to his father or to himself? Edward took good care that the Earl of Gloucester, whom he feared the most, would share his perils, if not his glory, in the East. With 60,000 men, Louis IX, accompanied by the Counts of Flanders, Brittany, Champagne, and other barons, left France to return to it no more. A storm drove the fleet to Sardinia, and there it was decided that the Crusaders should, in the first instance, go to Tunis. Charles of Anjou, the sovereign of Sicily, was anxious to maintain the rights of Christendom by exacting a tribute paid formerly to his predecessors. The devout Louis remembered, it is said, the messages from which the King of Tunis had expressed his wish to embrace Christianity, and thought that the presence of a large army would give him courage to make open confession of the true faith. In 1270 the army landed, and had encamped, we are told, on the site of Carthage, when a plague broke out, and amongst its crowd of victims struck the king. His whole life had been a prayer. It remained to the last a prayer for others rather than for himself. With serene submission to the divine counsels, he stretched himself on his couch of ashes, and as he uttered the words, "I will enter thy house, O Lord, I will worship in thy sanctuary," he died. When the English Edward had at last arrived in the camp, he saw that the idea of reaching Palestine before the winter was impracticable, and made up his mind to return to Sicily until the spring. When at last he reached Acre in 1271, he found that his name carried with it much of the terror associated with that of Richard Plantagenet. The Christians hastened to his standard, and with 7,000 men he attacked and took Nazareth, slaying the people with a massacre as pitiless as any which had sullied the chronicles of the Crusades. It was his first and his last victory in Palestine. His campaign was cut short by sickness and the dagger of an assassin sent by the Emir of Joppa as a bearer of letters touching his conversion to Christianity well nigh cut short his life. Edward hurled the murderer to the floor and stabbed him to the heart. But the dagger was undoubtedly poisoned, and it needed more than ordinary skill on the part of the surgeons to arrest the progress of the venom. The sides of the wound were carefully pared away, and the strength of youth, with the tender nursing of his wife Eleanor, did the rest. The romancers of a later age framed the tale that he must have died, had she not with her lips sucked the poison from the wound. It was clear that nothing more could be done in the Holy Land, and Edward knew not how soon his presence might become indispensable in England. A peace was made for 10 years, and the English Crusaders set out on their homeward voyage in 1272. For a long series of years Europe had been making vigorous efforts, and the result of these efforts had been nothing more substantial or permanent than the lines left on the sea sand by an ebbing tide. For one moment it seemed that the spirit of the dream might be changed when Theobald, Archdeacon of Liège, the friend of the English Edward, was summoned from Acre to fill the chair of St. Peter as Gregory X. Theobald had been an eye-witness of the desperate calamities which were crushing the Latins of Palestine, and he called the princes of Europe to the rescue with a zeal worthy of Innocent III. Or of Urban II. A council held at Lyons in 1274 decreed a new crusade. Rudolf of Habsburg, not yet firm in his imperial dignity, pledged himself to join it, and his example was followed by Michael Palaeologus, who 13 years earlier had put down the Latin dynasty in Constantinople. But Gregory died in less than 2 years after the assembly at Lyons, and his visions of renewed conquests in Palestine died with him. In the Holy Land itself, the miserable Christian remnant adhered to its old traditions of fighting about shadows when the substance had been already lost. Hugh III. Of Cyprus had himself crowned at Tyre as King of Jerusalem. The Templars urged the claims of Charles of Anjou. The Hospitallers insisted, with more sense, that the dispute might be postponed until they had recovered the kingdom, the title to which they were debating. A few years later, when Henry II. Of Cyprus held his shadowy dignity, 1289, the Grand Master of the Templars pleaded before Nicholas IV. The wrongs of the Latins, which could be avenged only by the blood of the Saracens. But the power of the ancient spell was broken. Nicholas was ready to furnish some men, but these were ruffians and criminals, the very offscourings of the people. Money he obstinately refused to give. The Grand Master was not more successful elsewhere, and the Italian robbers formed the whole force with which he returned to Palestine. The last forlorn struggle was made at Acre. Here, as elsewhere, the valour of the Templars shone conspicuous. The Grand Master rejected the bribes of the Sultan, but the latter cared little whether he could work on the venality of his enemies or whether he could not. His Mamelukes were not less courageous than the Templars, and their numbers were overwhelming. The assault began. The titular king of Jerusalem, Henry II. Of Cyprus, besought the Teutonic Knights to occupy his post, promising to return the next morning. His request was granted, but before the morning came, Henry was on his way to Cyprus. The attack was renewed with greater fury, but the Christians had lost all heart. The master of the Templars had been killed by a poisoned arrow, and 7 Knights Hospitallers sailed away, the last remnant of the magnificent order, which had braved successfully 1,000 dangers. The city was lost in 1291, but the horrors of the siege were not ended. The people had hurried to the shore, a storm prevented them from embarking, and the very sea was reddened by the blood of the last victims of a wild and fanatical superstition. End of section 24. Section 25 of the Crusades by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 15. The sequel of the religious wars. The Crusades had come to an end. The embers smouldered on, but it was to the last degree unlikely that they would be rekindled. The great military orders withdrew to seek a field for their energies elsewhere. The Teutonic Knights to the dreary regions of Lithuania and Poland. The Knights of the Hospital first to Cyprus, then to Rhodes, where after many a hard fight with the Greeks and Saracens, they achieved the conquest of the whole island and settled down to repose in their earthly paradise. The dream of returning to Palestine still haunted the mind of Edward I, who by his will left £30,000 for the equipment and maintenance of the knights who were to bear his heart to the Holy Land. But probably the last reflection of the old fire is seen in the words by which Henry V, in his dying moments, asserted the bounden duty of princes to build the walls of Jerusalem, and declared that had he been spared for a longer life, or had he lived in quieter times, he would have undertaken this task of restoration. Even now, perhaps, the task was one of no insuperable difficulty. Its practicability had been shown more than once by its accomplishment, but it was one which must be taken in hand in the spirit of that wise and tolerant statesmanship which seeks to further the interests of the subject population and to make one people of the conquerors and the conquered. This idea was, as we have seen, deliberately rejected by the first Crusaders, and with the single exception of the Emperor Henry at Constantinople, by all who followed them. There is no reason to suppose that the English Henry V would have been animated by a wiser spirit and larger character than the companions of Godfrey and Tancred. The soil of Palestine had been watered abundantly with the blood both of Christians and of infidels. The soil of Europe, chiefly that of France, was to drink the blood of that haughty but valiant order which had done as much to destroy as to maintain the hold of Latin Christendom on Palestine. Among all the monstrous iniquities which perjured kings and godless statesmen have ever perpetrated, the lies and cruelties, the persistent and diabolical injustice which attended the suppression of the Knights Templars, must hold very nearly the first place. These men may have, nay, undoubtedly they had committed enormous crimes themselves, but these were crimes done in the sight of the sun and shared by all Crusaders of every generation, the saintly Louis of France forming, it would seem, the solitary exception. Now, when their services were no longer needed, or could no more be of use in Palestine, the benefits to be derived from a confiscation of their properties became patent to Philip the Fair, the brutal tyrant, the profligate murderer, the unscrupulous thief who bullied the Pope, Clement V., into a recognition of charges in 1309, which at first he had rightly cast aside as absurd, extravagant, and impossible. False witness, torture, hunger, thirst, darkness, filth, and disease in sunless dungeons were all used with consummate skill and pertinacity to subdue the warriors, who in the field had never quailed. Taken one by one, some made confessions which were drawn from them by excruciating agonies, and which, when those agonies ceased, were indignantly withdrawn. In 1314, with his remaining comrades, the last Grand Master died, solemnly asserting the innocence of his order, an innocence unquestionably real, if we confine ourselves to the charges brought against them by Philip and his myrmidons, and the kings of France, made wealthier by their iniquities, laid up another count for the great indictment to be brought against their luckless representative in the French Revolution. In England, the proceedings against the Templars, shameful though they were, fell infinitely short of the disgrace which covered the king and the judges of France. But in both countries it was seen what might be done by malignant lies uttered boldly under the plea of maintaining the truth and righteousness of God. In this process we see, in fact, the legitimate result of the Crusades. The unbelief of the Saracen was a sufficient reason for wresting from him a country which was regarded as the inalienable heritage of Christendom. The alleged unbelief or profanity of Templars was a sufficient reason for hounding on judges to their destruction, and the heresies truly or falsely alleged against any persons whatsoever would be a thorough warrant for carrying fire and sword through their land, if gentler means failed to extort submission. The lesson had been soon learnt, and while Dandolo and Baldwin were laying the foundation of the short-lived Latin Empire at Constantinople, Innocent was preaching a crusade against the peaceable, although perhaps not strictly orthodox, subjects of Count Raymond of Toulouse. The attempt to put down error by force during the Albigensian Crusades, 1208 to 1249, was producing its natural fruits, and men like Bernard and Innocent were brought to consider every means lawful, every weapon hallowed, against the wretched enemies of Christ and of his Church. Horrible miscreants, like the Inquisitors, Fulk of Marseille and Arnold of Amaury, could without a pang of remorse involve in one common slaughter the aged and the young, the mother and the infant, and Simon of Montfort, cased in the triple armour of a heart harder than the nether millstone, could exult with savage joy over the massacres of his sword and the torments of the Inquisition. In this awful chaos, Frederick II, the enemy of the Pope, the friends of Saracenic philosophers, of Moslem women, joined furiously in the fray. Near in its ideal and similar in some points of its development, as was the careless society of the troubadour to his own luxurious civilization in Sicily, yet not a sign is there to show that he regarded with the least emotion its rapid and terrible catastrophe. His appreciation of their gay science, of their art, their refinement, and their luxury was chilled and quenched by the thought of the vile crowd of Petrobrusians and other vulgar heretics by whom these careless voluptuaries were surrounded. Well may it be said that never in any history were the principles of justice, the faith of treaties, common humanity, so trampled underfoot as in the Albigensian Crusade. "Slay on! God will know his own!" was the cry of the papal legate before the walls of Béziers. And this easy method of settling a long controversy was the moral logically drawn from the preaching of the hermit Peter and of Bernard of Clairvaux. It is possible that the historian who seeks to account for all the characteristics which mark the era of the Crusades may connect these expeditions with some events which should be traced to other causes. The impulses which bring vast crowds together for any purpose are always more or less contagious, and the Middle Ages exhibit throughout a series of enthusiastic risings. The outbreak of the Pasteureux, or shepherds, so called for their supposed simplicity, which for a time led astray even Blanche of Castile, took place perhaps only by an accidental coincidence, while Louis IX. Was a captive in Egypt. But it was only one of 1,000 instances of what has well been termed superstition set in motion. To this class belongs probably the expeditions known as the Children's Crusades, although these were started with the idea of recovering the Holy Cross from the infidel. A few words may suffice to tell the miserable story, how in 1212 in France, under the boy Stephen, 30,000 children encamped around Vendôme, how 10,000 were lost or had strayed away before they reached Marseille a month later, how there they waited under a conviction that the waters of the Mediterranean would be cloven asunder to give them a passage on dry land, how at length 2 merchants offered, for the cause of God and without charge, to convey them in ships to Palestine, and how the 5,000 children who sailed from the harbour chanting the hymn Veni Creator Spiritus found themselves at the end of their voyage in the slave markets of Alexandria and Algiers. A pendant to this woeful tale is found in the sufferings of the 20,000 German boys and girls who set out in the same year from Cologne under the peasant lad Nicholas, 20,000 strong, and of whom 5,000 only reached Genoa. Of the rest, some had returned home, some marched to Brindisi, and setting sail for Palestine were never heard of more. The fortune of those who found their way to Genoa was more happy. Invited to settle there by the Senate, many became wealthy, and not a few, rising to distinction, founded some of the noblest families in the state. But as the motives which led to the Crusades were complex, so their results were complex also. The picture must not be presented only in its darker aspects. We have seen the effect which they produced on the growth of the temporal power of the popes. We must not forget that by rolling back the tide of Mohammedan conquest from Constantinople for upwards of 4 centuries, they probably saved Europe from horrors the recital of which might even now make our ears tingle. That by weakening the resources of the power of the barons, they strengthened the authority of the kings acting in alliance with the citizens of the great towns. That this alliance broke up the feudal system, gradually abolished serfdom, and substituted the authority of a common law for the arbitrary will of chiefs who, for real or supposed affronts, rushed to the arbitrament of private war. Worthless in themselves and wholly useless as means of founding any permanent dominion in Palestine or elsewhere, these enterprises have affected the commonwealths of Europe in ways of which the promoters never dreamed. They left a wider gulf between the Greek and the Latin churches, between the subjects of the Eastern Empire and the nations of Western Europe, but by the mere fact of throwing East and West together, they led gradually to that interchange of thought and that awakening of the human intellect to which we owe all that distinguishes our modern civilization from the religious and political systems of the Middle Ages. End of section 25. Recording by Pamela Nagami, MD, on November 16th, in the year of the plague, 2020. End of the Crusades by George William Cox.